All right, we are live. I wanted to start off with this image right here. Bear with me, I'm not really techno savvy, so yeah. Um, this is an image of what is left of the vehicles of Task Force Faith. That's all that's left. Um, it's a rather sad story. Um, in the annals of the history of the United States Army, it's one of those stories that's not talked about at all. The short version is that the 7th Infantry Division was tasked by the 10 Corps commander at the time. Time everybody thought they'd be home by Christmas, and in fact, um, some 7th Division units were actually on the Yalu River. Um, on the night of 27th November 1950, pretty much all of that ended when the Chinese attacked in absolutely overwhelming numbers. Task Force Faith was basically systematically destroyed over a period of about 5 days. Well, 4 days, 5 nights. What ended up happening is, as the time progressed, the task force basically started to fall apart. More and more leaders were killed, and the communication broke down. Everything fell apart, and as a poet once famously said, everything falls apart when the center cannot hold. Well, unfortunately for Task Force Faith, that's exactly what happened. Uh, just to give you an idea of the overall tactical disposition on the 27th of November, you have right here the 1st Marine Division had the 5th Marines and the 7th Marines. The 1st Marine Rear CP was here. 31st Rear CP was here. 3rd Battalion, 31st Infantry was here along the Punggye-ri Gang Inlet. And then 1st Battalion, 32nd Infantry was there in the forward perimeter. They held that perimeter for 2 days. The first night, Captain Ed Scullion, Alpha Company Commander, was, or actually the Able Company at the time, 8 Company Commander, 1st Battalion, 32nd Infantry. The forward air controller, Captain Stanford, of the Marine Corps, was able to take command of the company for the night and hold off further Chinese attacks until daylight, when he resumed his role as forward air control for the task force, or at least for the battalion. What happened at the inlet perimeter is a little bit more fortunate. Almost immediately, the battalion command staff of 3rd Battalion, 31st Infantry was taken out of the fight. The forward air controller was killed. The battalion commander was wounded. Most of the battalion staff was killed. And the same can be said for the battalion staff of the 57th Field Artillery. 3rd Battalion, 31st Infantry was hit very hard, and in the process, several infantrymen had to evacuate or were pushed back to the artillery positions. Alpha Battery was overrun, and B Battery was the fallback position that eventually became the last stand. When the sun rose, they fought their way back to A Battery and found that, in fact, there were still soldiers near the guns holding off the Chinese. And during the day, 331 was able to retake their positions, or at least shore up their perimeter, but with no battalion command staff, it was kind of iffy. On the second night, 28th November, 28 to 29 November, a penetration was made in 1st Battalion, 32nd Infantry that they were never able to reseal. There was basically a bend in the lines that they couldn't fix. And Colonel Faith realized that, the time of the task force commander, Colonel McLean, he withdrew to the inlet perimeter. And for the most part, this was a successful withdrawal. The Chinese didn't really follow, and even though he had to leave behind a platoon, more or less 1st Battalion, 32nd Infantry made it intact to the inlet perimeter. Now, at the inlet perimeter, it was absolutely hellacious. And many who survived the actual battle had said that if the anti-aircraft weapons of the 15th Anti-Aircraft Battalion, Battery D, hadn't been there, the inlet perimeter would not have survived the second night. If you ever read East of Chosin by Roy E. Appleman, who was a retired lieutenant colonel, it describes in great detail mountains of bodies. The 40mm was just an absolute troop killer. Whole columns of men were just wiped from the battlefield. And that is something that becomes very important as the battle goes on. A lot of the times, the only reason that thing happens is because these anti-aircraft weapons are delivering such murderous fire on the Chinese. And also the close air support of the Marine Corsairs and RAF P-51s. Well, at the time they were F-51s. When the inlet perimeter became stabilized, they stayed there from 29 November to 1 December. And during that time, the task force just continued to deteriorate. During the retrograde movement of 1st Battalion, 32nd Infantry, Colonel McLean disappears, and so you have battalion staff for both 132 and 331, basically filling in for the battalions, for everyone else, and it's a conglomerate command. During the process, they managed to hold out, but the number of wounded is continuing to grow, and it's causing issues. At some point, it becomes very clear to Colonel Faith and the rest of the staff that they just can't hold it anymore. There's no help coming, and they need to get out. Unfortunately for Colonel Faith and the entire task force, there was very little effort made to evacuate the wounded. In fact, they had created a landing zone for helicopters, and unfortunately, only four troops were removed during the entire period that they were at the inlet perimeter. This is extremely unfortunate because had the task force not had um, so many wounded troops, and it's estimated at 500 plus, um, they could have easily just gone across the ice as a dismounted infantry force. Um, but because there were 500 wounded troops, they had to have truck column. And unfortunately, the movement back to Marine Corps Rear CP was hellacious. And along the way, during the initial breakout, a friendly fire incident occurred and a bunch of troops were napalmed. And then when they got to one of the commanding fire blocks, Hill 1221, more troops were lost. And at about this time, the task force just falls apart. As soon as the sun goes down, the air support is gone. One of the last runs of air support, unfortunately, again, friendly fire incident, killed more troops. And most of the troops at this point have little to no ammo once they attacked Hill 1221. A lot of the troops that attacked the hill just kind of went up and over and just kept going to Hagerui, which was where the Marine Corps Rear CP was. A lot of them didn't have any weapons, or their weapons had malfunctioned, so they got rid of them. Many of them didn't have any ammo. Many of them had wounds, and it was just pretty much every man for himself. The truck column, in the process of trying to get through Hill 1221, there was a fire block, and in the process of attacking this, Lieutenant Colonel Faith led a bunch of troops and was wounded by a grenade. And that essentially left the task force completely leaderless. The few remaining leaders that were there tried to do everything they could to do something, but a lot of the troops were completely beyond exhaustion. At one point in Colonel Appleman's book, he talks about one of the officers said if we had shot them just to get their attention, it wouldn't have made any difference. Unfortunately, all the infantry support that was available was gone. The infantry basically had dissolved. There were no unit leaders left, and an every man for himself atmosphere took hold. And it should be mentioned that during the breakout, basically being a truck driver was a suicide mission. The Chinese were pouring fire into the truck column, and it was rather unfortunate. A lot of the troops that were wounded were killed. And you had situations where people would be wounded along the breakout attempts, and they'd be thrown into the trucks, and then trucks would break down, so they'd have to throw more people in the trucks. And you hear stories of people just being piled in up to the canvas top, and it's overcrowding like you wouldn't believe. And of course, a lot of the times they're going over rails and bumping around, and the troops are just screaming in absolute agony. And it's the story as Colonel Appleman describes it is really just absolutely hellacious. After Colonel Faith was wounded, they made it to about where the 31st Rear CP had been just one day before, and there was one more fire block, and unfortunately that's where the task force fell apart, and the truck column was surrounded and destroyed. And in the end, it was pretty much all over but the screaming. Chinese troops went through the truck column and systematically killed a lot of troops. A lot of people that they would throw incendiary grenades into the back or set the trucks on fire. Anybody who tried to get out was bayoneted. There were some prisoners taken and later released or escaped, but for the most part, a lot of the people in the truck column just died. Anybody who offered any type of resistance, including at least one company commander in 3rd Battalion, 31st Infantry, were just killed. And, you know, it's kind of hard to see what resistance at that point could have done. Task Force Faith is kind of a personal story for me because my great uncle, PFC Max Leon Bailey, was part of Company M, 31st Infantry, the heavy weapons company. He had been in the Army just 7 months when he walked into Chosin, and he didn't walk back out. The date that is listed as missing in action is the 30th of November, which makes me think that he was probably wounded or killed before the breakout attempt. But anybody who probably witnessed his death or anybody who might have known him is either dead themselves or, you know, I probably will never. And it's rather unfortunate. My grandpa and all his brothers, except for Max, served in World War II. One was a tanker in Patton's Third Army. My grandpa had several kamikaze runs on him, and he got a Purple Heart. And actually, to his dying day, still had pieces of Japanese drill in him. And his youngest brother was only in the Army about 7 months when he died. And, you know, whenever my grandpa got to talking about Max, it bothered him deeply. And so I got to reading about what happened to Task Force Faith, and it's as bad as could possibly get. I recently got to see a documentary that was made about the task force, and a lot of it was based on Colonel Appleman's book, but there were survivor interviews, and it was just absolutely unbelievable. One of the saddest things about the entire situation is there is unquestioning bravery shown by the troops involved. Anybody who reads through Colonel Appleman's book or watches the documentary will understand that what happened was absolutely beyond question, above and beyond what anyone could have expected of these troops. The 7th Infantry Division at the time was a hollow shell. A lot of the most important key leaders had been pulled to help units that were in the Pusan perimeter. So when the 7th Infantry Division was there for the Incheon landings, they were basically 25% of the unit strength were these ROK soldiers, the Korean augmentees, the U.S. Army, KATUSAs, that were very poor in quality as soldiers. And it's extremely unfortunate. And then also you have to understand that at the time, 7th Infantry Division was on garrison duty. They weren't really training for warfare the same way. The drawdown from 1945 really hurt the Army. So when Korea rolled around, the Army just was not prepared for the kind of combat that was seen. Another thing that needs to be understood is that everything that could have been done to extricate the task force probably was. It's easy to say in hindsight, well, they should never have gone north. It's easy to say that the task force commander, the regimental commander, Colonel McLean, should have consolidated his units and then gone north. And Colonel Appleman's criticisms are pretty fair in some aspects. The fact that the task force was so spread out over about a 10-mile area, and the fact that it was put together so haphazardly almost led to almost set up the entire unit for failure. And another thing that is very clear from the outset, when Colonel Faith took over as task force commander, he had never led troops in combat before, and there were certain things that he probably should have done before the breakout began, or certain things that he should have done to ensure success that he didn't do. One of which was trying to get in touch with higher headquarters. Now, protocol was that higher headquarters had a responsibility to get in touch with lower headquarters, but the fact that no one had really any kind of contact between 1st Marine Division and the 7th Division units on the east side of Chosin is very troubling. The fact that there was no contact with the 31st Rear CP and the units forward of Hill 1221, it kind of makes you wonder, what was going on, what was the commo situation, how could they have possibly gotten in touch and potentially gotten help. There's one instance that Colonel Appleman highlights, actually 2 times. The 31st Tank Company got a resupply of 40mm ammo. 40mm ammo for the dual self-propelled dual 40mm anti-aircraft weapons that were so vital to the task force's survival. 40mm ammo ended up in the rear CP area, where there were no anti-aircraft weapons. And then tank ammo ended up in the inlet perimeter, where there were no tanks. So you have resupply issues. And the fact that when the breakout occurred, a lot of the troops had no ammo to speak of. It raises questions of how higher headquarters failed to support the task force. As much as it's easy to castigate the pilots, the Corsair pilots who unfortunately bombed too close, the simple truth is that Captain Sanford was calling in for strikes that were within 100 meters of the troops. The friendly fire incident when the breakout occurred is one of the more tragic incidents, because entrusting it to the 31st Infantry at that point was probably not the best idea. And unfortunately, 31st Infantry was just, it would have been mauled. The damage done during the first and second nights at the inlet perimeter were such that relying on these troops for anything more than the most basic, assault here, do this, do that, was probably beyond what should be expected. I don't know. What could have been done to extricate. And it's easy to say in retrospect, okay, Colonel Faith should have done this, Colonel Faith should have done that. Honestly, armchair generals can sit there and say a lot of things. When you're in the situation, we have to understand it's minus 30 degrees. They've been fighting a battle for pretty much 5 days straight. Their supplies are gone. Almost everybody has wounds of some kind. The leadership is almost completely gone. It goes on and on. In fact, speaking of the leadership, I was going through the book, and I counted only 3 of the company commanders that initially started the battle made it out alive. Captain Kitts, Captain McClimate, and Captain Bigger. The company commanders for A, B, and C companies were killed of 31st Infantry. I believe the L company commander for 31st Infantry was killed during the final roadblock when the convoy was overrun. B and C of 32nd Infantry were killed during the breakout, probably around the broken bridge. There's no real good, in that. I think we need to talk about our defeats almost as much as we need to talk about our defeats. The 1st Marine Division is absolutely right and justified in talking about how brave the 1st Marine Division was and attacking in a different direction. Bravo, it was great and all that other stuff. But we also need to remember that the 1st Marines Rear CP would not have survived if Task Force Faith hadn't been blocking a better part of 40,000 PLA troops. The Chinese divisions, which were meant to attack the east side of the 1st Marines Rear CP, didn't make it there because this Army task force was holding them up, and the amount of Chinese that the task force had killed is very difficult to estimate, but it did play a significant role in the Marines' ability to extricate themselves. It's estimated that Task Force Faith took on at least 2 Chinese divisions, and that's anywhere from about 30,000 to 40,000 troops, and that's just the fighters. That's not even talking about support troops or anything like that. The fact that they were able to successfully tie up so many troops might have been the critical linchpin for the Marines. Had the Rear CP at Hageruri been overrun, the Marines would have been hooped, to put it mildly. Unfortunately, Marine Corps officers and one particular Navy chaplain had a very dim view of the survivors that they saw from the Army. They were haggard. A lot of them didn't have weapons. There were some that weren't wounded, but it seemed like they hadn't fought at all. And there was an initial impression of a lot of the troops that had survived the battle that was very negative. And unfortunately, this impression has lasted. It has endured. And you will hear Marines to this day talk about Chosin, and 1st Marine Division will proudly talk about what happened at Chosin as one of their great high water marks. But unfortunately, Task Force Faith gets left out. Or if they're talked about at all, it's all the Army troops, they kind of were there and we saved their ass. And unfortunately, that's not what happened. I think the Army needs to talk about its failures as much as it needs to talk about its victories. We can sit here and talk about LG X-Ray and how great it was that Colonel Moore was able to hold off the whole mess of North Vietnamese. We can sit here and talk about the Thunder Run into Baghdad. We can sit here and talk about, Overlord and many of the other great Army victories. But we also have to talk about our defeats. Institutionally speaking, the Army needs to have that kind of memory. We need to look at Kasserine Pass and what happened there. We need to look at some of our failures at places like Jella and Chosin. Hill 875. Just to name a few. There are many battles that were losses, but not quite losses, and then there are some battles that were just, there's no other way to describe it. Task Force Faith was a loss, and it's hard to look at that. It's hard to look at defeat and say, and try to draw anything out of it. And the defeat that Task Force Faith suffered is just so utterly heartbreaking. Anyone who listens to the stories of these troops, anyone who hears just how awful the conditions were, it's hard not to feel emotional. It's hard not to feel a sense of absolute rage that they were so close to saying the truck column was destroyed within sight almost of where the 31st Rear CG was one day before. That is something that is really hard not to feel a certain sense of rage about. It's hard to not rage at the situation. Ned Almond, the 10 Corps commander, is sitting there talking about, oh, well, they're just a bunch of Chinese laundrymen, and like, the guy was an idiot. He was an absolute idiot. He should never have been in charge of 10 Corps. It's hard to read about the situation and not feel something about it. I hope that the Army starts looking at its defeats more. I hope that when we lose, and we will lose, as an institution, that we are able to look at our failures and learn from them. There are a lot of lessons that can be learned from Task Force Faith, and I think we owe it to ourselves, not just the United States Army and anyone who's ever served in the Army to know about this task force, but also the American public. We need to know what warfighting is. And I hope this has been at least somewhat educational for you. If you haven't served in the Army, I know it's probably a lot of jargon, and I really recommend you go read the book. It might fill in some of the blanks for you. This is just a brief overview. So with that said, I hope you've got something out of this. Good night.